January 1977. Studio One, NBC, Burbank. The red light above camera 2 held steady, and somewhere in the American night, 17 million people waited without knowing what they were waiting for. Johnny Carson sat behind the desk, the same curved walnut surface that had become, without announcement or ceremony, the most powerful 4 feet of real estate in American entertainment. His left hand rested near the telephone, a beige rotary model placed there by a stagehand 90 seconds before airtime. It was not a prop. The wire ran live to an outside line, vetted by network security but open to chance in a way that made the show's director, Fred de Cordova, visibly uncomfortable during rehearsal. Carson had insisted. The bit required genuine uncertainty, the kind that could not be faked even by an entertainer who had spent 2 decades perfecting the appearance of effortless control. The Tonight Show in 1977 was not merely a television program. It was the last stop on a cultural assembly line that determined which comedians would work, which actors would ascend, which books would sell, and which ideas would enter the American living room. An appearance with Carson could resurrect a career thought dead or destroy one thought invincible. His approval, a laugh, a gesture toward the guest chair, an invitation to sit after a stand-up set, functioned as a form of currency more valuable than a studio contract. And yet Carson himself remained elusive, a man who performed accessibility while maintaining a distance that even his closest colleagues described as absolute. The telephone bit had become a semi-regular feature. Carson would dial a random number live on air and attempt a brief conversation with whoever answered. It was designed to feel spontaneous, vaguely dangerous, and to showcase Carson's improvisational skill, his ability to remain charming and in control even when the script dissolved. Most calls ended quickly. A confused housewife in Kansas, a teenager who giggled and hung up, occasionally someone who recognized the voice and froze, and Carson would gently guide them through 30 seconds of television before moving on. The audience loved it because it felt real, and because it placed Carson in a minor vulnerability, a rare glimpse of the mechanism behind the ease. But this call, placed at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time on a Tuesday in mid-January, would not follow the pattern. Carson dialed. The rotary mechanism clicked audibly in the studio silence. The phone rang once, twice, a sound carried through the NBC sound system and into homes across 4 time zones. On the 3rd ring, the line opened. A voice answered, male, older, unmistakable even across a telephone line compressed through 1970s broadcast technology. Carson's face changed. Not dramatically, he was far too disciplined for that, but enough that the studio audience, trained by years of watching him, felt the shift before they understood it. His hand tightened slightly on the receiver. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. The pause that followed lasted less than 2 seconds, but in the grammar of live television, it was an eternity. He had reached Jack Benny. The history of American comedy in the 20th century can be understood in part through the relationship between these 2 men. Jack Benny had defined radio comedy in the 1930s and 40s, then successfully transitioned to television in the 1950s, creating a program that prioritized character over spectacle, timing over volume, and a carefully constructed persona, vain, cheap, perpetually 39, over the crude aggression that characterized earlier vaudeville styles. By the time Carson took over The Tonight Show in 1962, Benny was already a legend, a figure whose influence shaped everyone who followed. Carson had studied him, absorbed his timing, learned that silence, properly deployed, could be more powerful than any punchline. Benny was 77 years old in 1977. He had been retired from weekly television for over a decade, though he continued to make occasional appearances, guest spots, variety show cameos. His health was declining. He would be dead before the year ended,
though no one outside his immediate circle knew how close the end was. He remained sharp, funny, but increasingly fragile, a man who belonged to an earlier era of show business, one built on live performance, radio intimacy, and a kind of professionalism that resisted the ironic detachment beginning to creep into American culture. Carson had not intended to call him. The number had been selected at random from a Los Angeles phone directory, a genuine accident facilitated by pure statistical chance. But once the voice identified itself, Benny answered his own phone, a habit from an age before assistants and managers controlled access. Carson could not simply hang up. To do so would violate the unspoken contract of the bit, would expose it as less spontaneous than advertised. And yet to continue placed him in an impossible position. He was speaking.
To understand why this moment carried such weight requires understanding what Johnny Carson represented by 1977. He had hosted The Tonight Show for 15 years, a tenure that had transformed him from a competent Midwestern comedian into something resembling a national referee. Politicians sought his approval. Cultural shifts were legitimized or dismissed based on whether Carson acknowledged them during the monologue. He had survived controversies, network disputes, competition from other late-night programs, and the constant pressure of producing 90 minutes of live entertainment 5 nights a week. He had done so by maintaining absolute control over the content, the guests, the rhythm of each show. His authority was quiet but total, enforced not through aggression but through a kind of impenetrable competence. But that authority had always been borrowed, in a sense, from the generation that preceded him, from Benny, from Bob Hope, from performers who had built American comedy when the medium was still being invented. Carson was the inheritor, the custodian, but not the originator. And now, on live television with millions watching, he was speaking to the source. The conversation that followed lasted less than 3 minutes. Carson recovered quickly. He was too skilled not to, but the recovery itself was revealing. He deferred, asked questions rather than delivering lines, allowed Benny to control the rhythm. Benny, for his part, seemed delighted by the accident, his voice warm and amused, a man who had spent 60 years in show business and could not be rattled by a telephone call. He asked Carson how the show was going, complimented a recent monologue, offered a gentle joke about Carson's golf game, a detail he could only have known from reading interviews or hearing industry gossip, proof that even in semi-retirement, Benny remained connected, aware, still paying attention. Carson laughed, a real laugh, not the performative chuckle he deployed when a guest's story was running long and needed to be wrapped. The audience laughed with him, but the texture of the laughter had changed. It was no longer the laughter of a crowd watching a comedian work. It was the laughter of witnesses to a private moment accidentally made public, a glimpse of Carson as something other than the figure behind the desk. When the call ended, Benny excused himself politely, said he did not want to take up too much of Johnny's time. Carson placed the receiver down carefully, as if it were something fragile. He looked at the audience, shook his head slightly. Then, without explanation, he moved into a commercial break 30 seconds earlier than scheduled. The footage exists in the NBC archive, but it has rarely been broadcast, not because of any controversy or legal restriction, but because it resists the packaging that typically defines clip shows and retrospectives. It is too quiet, too internal. The drama exists entirely in subtext, in the brief dissolution of a persona that Carson had spent 2 decades constructing. To understand its significance requires understanding the context, the history, the specific relationship between these two men and what they represented within the machinery of American entertainment. Fred de Cordova, who directed The Tonight Show from 1970 until Carson's retirement, later described the moment in his memoir as the only time I ever saw Johnny genuinely surprised on air. He noted that Carson had spent the remainder of that night's show slightly off his rhythm,
Not enough for a casual viewer to notice, but enough that the crew, people who had worked with him for years and knew his patterns, recognized something had shifted. The guests that followed, a minor film actor and a comedian whose name has since faded from memory, received less of Carson's attention than usual. He was present, but distracted, a version of himself still processing what had occurred. Benny himself never publicly commented on the call. He died 9 months later, in December 1977, and the obituaries that followed focused on his radio career, his television program, his influence on comedy as an art form. The Tonight Show phone call, if it was mentioned at all, appeared as a footnote, a minor anecdote in a life that had spanned the entire history of American broadcast entertainment. But for those who study Carson, who recognize his work as not merely comedy, but as a form of cultural architecture, the moment remains significant. It revealed something that Carson typically kept hidden: his awareness of his own place in a continuum, his understanding that the authority he wielded had been passed down, inherited from men like Benny, who had built the infrastructure he now occupied. It was a reminder that even the most powerful figure in television was, ultimately, standing on someone else's foundation. The desk itself, the physical object, had been redesigned twice during Carson's tenure, but its symbolic function remained unchanged. It was a barrier and a throne, a piece of furniture that separated Carson from his guests, from the audience, from the chaos that live television constantly threatened to unleash. When a guest was invited to sit beside it, they had passed a test. When Carson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, he was signaling skepticism. When he leaned forward, engaged, the audience leaned forward with him. The desk was the instrument through which he conducted the show, and by extension, conducted the culture. But during that phone call, the desk offered no protection. It became just a piece of wood, a surface cluttered with index cards and a coffee mug, and a telephone that had betrayed him by connecting to the one person in America whose approval Carson still, perhaps unconsciously, sought.
In the years that followed, Carson rarely spoke about Benny in interviews, though he would occasionally reference him during monologues, always with a reverence that bordered on the personal. When Carson himself retired in 1992, the comparisons to Benny were inevitable. Both men had defined their eras. Both had maintained control through understatement rather than spectacle. Both had understood that the most powerful performance was the one that appeared effortless, that concealed the machinery behind the ease. What the telephone call revealed, accidentally and briefly, was the machinery itself. It showed that Carson's authority was not innate but constructed, learned, inherited from a tradition that stretched back before television, before even radio, to vaudeville stages and small-town theaters where performers honed timing in front of audiences who would walk out if the act failed. Carson had mastered that tradition so completely that it looked like instinct, but it was not. It was craft, studied and refined over decades, and for one unscripted moment, the craft became visible. The audience that night did not fully understand what they had witnessed. Television criticism in 1977 was not yet sophisticated enough to dissect such moments, and the clip was never replayed with the kind of analytical commentary that would become common in later decades. But the people in Studio One, and perhaps some of the viewers watching at home, felt the shift, felt the brief disruption in the rhythm that usually carried them smoothly from monologue to commercial to guest segment to closing credits. Television, at its most powerful, functions as a mirror. It reflects the culture that produces it, but it also shapes that culture, determines what is visible and what remains hidden, what is valued and what is dismissed. Johnny Carson, for 30 years, controlled that mirror. He decided what America would laugh at, what it would take seriously, what it would remember. But on a Tuesday in January 1977, the mirror turned. For less than 3 minutes, Carson was no longer the one holding it. He was the one being reflected. And what the audience saw was not the polished persona they had come to trust, but something more human, more vulnerable, more real.
The red light above camera 2 stayed on. The show continued. By the next night, the rhythm had been restored, and Carson was once again the figure behind the desk, in control, unshakable, the man who could guide America through scandal and tragedy and triumph with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a perfectly timed pause. But the telephone remained on the desk, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed performance could be interrupted by chance, by history, by the simple accident of dialing the wrong number at the right time. And in that interruption, for those paying close enough attention, was a glimpse of the truth that Carson spent his entire career concealing, that authority is always temporary, always borrowed, always dependent on the voices that came before. The applause sign blinked, the audience responded, and Johnny Carson, once again, became the man they needed him to be.